evening. I'm Dr. Grace Telesco, and welcome to the Criminal Justice Forum. We're live streaming from the NSU Fischler College of Education and School of Criminal Justice YouTube channel. Each of our programs examine exciting topics in the field of criminal justice, and all of our guests bring fascinating and thought-provoking topics to life, as each of our educational programs bridge the gap between theory and practice. Welcome to the Criminal Justice Forum. Welcome, everybody. My name is Dr. Grace Telesco, and I am with the Fischler College of Education, School of Criminal Justice at Nova Southeastern University. And I am so thrilled to have with me tonight a very, very, very special guest. And I'm going to read her bio first. I mean, she really doesn't need an introduction, but we're going to do it anyway. Dr. Lenore Walker is a clinical forensic psychologist, is a professor emeritus at Nova Southeastern University in the College of Psychology. She is a leader in the field of domestic violence and founded the Domestic Violence Institute. She's testified as an expert witness in trials involving domestic abuse and has developed many domestic violence training programs and drafted legislative reform. Dr. Walker interviewed 1,500 women who had been subjected to domestic violence and found that there was a similar pattern of abuse called the cycle of abuse. And she wrote the book, The Battered Woman, for which she won the Distinguished Media Award. There's so much more than just that, seriously, but, you know, in the interest of time and instead of describing her, you'll just hear from her. But I did want to say one tiny little thing that tonight is really special to me personally, because when I was going for my doctorate at Fordham University in New York, and I was studying mental health and social work, my PhDs in social work, my dissertation was on domestic violence. And I did a quantitative study that looked at personality attributes as predictors of domestic violence among couples. And Dr. Lenore Walker was all over my chapter 2. You know, I mean, when I was doing the literature review, and some of you who are PhD students understand and know that chapter 2 is a big chapter. It's a big deal. It informs everything. It informs our research questions. It informs the variables that we'll examine. It just informs everything. For me, Dr. Walker was just instrumental in my understanding of domestic violence. So when I was an adjunct, I happened to be on a committee, a dissertation committee, and Dr. Walker was on the committee with me. And I almost fainted. And I'm almost fainting tonight too. So I'm starstruck. I really so much appreciate and honor you and respect your work. And I'm just thrilled that you've said yes to us tonight. And I'm going to ask you a question.
After a build-up like that, I don't know.
But it's true. It's all true. So, I mean, it's how I feel, you know. I mean, I love all my guests, and I have such admiration for all of my guests. But you in particular, really, you bring me back, you know, you bring me back to the 90s. And when I was doing my literature review, Dr. Walker, I was learning a lot about how, you know, the feminist lens, the feminist perspective, the battered women's movement of the 80s really helped to inform the literature after that. And, you know, there's Ellen Pence's Power and Control Wheel and learned helplessness, all of that. What's changed? Now we're in 2023, and oh my God, I mean, we probably could do this for 2 hours telling us what has changed. But what, if anything, in the literature, in the theory, in the perspective, anything about policy or practice that you feel has changed since then, since you wrote the book, The Battered Woman, and today?
Wow. Well, it's first, let me say what a pleasure it is to be here with you, Dr. Telesco. I remember you on that committee that we were on together number of years ago, and I was struck by the brilliance of your knowledge, and especially in methodology. Really important. So this is a great opportunity for us to have a good discussion. So let me get back to your question with what has changed. And I would have to say everything and nothing, which is really the best way I can put it. In terms of the theories, they have not changed at all. The theories that domestic violence is an equal opportunity possibility, that there really are no particular psychological characteristics that will foretell that a woman is going to become a battered woman. At the same time, we do know a lot more about the abuser, and that he, and it's almost always a he, 5% of the abusers that we know about are women. The other 95% are men. And that's not only true for domestic violence in the home, but it's also true if we look at all the violence in the world. When we look at the shooters, the school shooters who come into the schools, or the people who go into a stadium and shoot up people, almost all of those are men as well. So the issue of violence and what makes a man violent is really what we should be studying. And unfortunately, there just isn't enough research going on that should be connecting that with the observant and experience in some cases, but certainly the being in situations where young boys are seeing and hearing and feeling domestic violence. And we knew that from the start, but it hasn't really moved that much in the last 20, 30, I guess that's a long time since the 1990s, but that has not moved where I would have liked it to move. There are so many things that we could be doing. But on the other hand, we know so much more about how to help people heal from the impact of domestic violence. That's an area that everybody wants to study in psychology. And so we're doing quite well in that particular area.
Before we went live, I was throwing around a name, and it sticks in my right in my throat. A man by the name of Dutton, right? Dutton wrote a book, rethinking domestic violence, and talking about kind of this notion that men are battered too. And while that's true, can you elaborate a little bit on like the nuances and the distinction between, you mentioned 5%. However, we do know that women certainly batter. We know that, but there's something that's a little unique and different about female batterers versus male batterers.
It's true. If you take a look across the spectrum, what we really find is that approximately 20 to 25% of the cases that we know about. Now, I want to make it very clear, we don't know about every case of domestic violence. So much of it is private, but we know a lot. And in the ones that we do know about, what we know is that there could be mutual violence, about 20% or so. But the violence is often begun by the man. And for the woman, it's often violence for protection. It's usually self-defense. And yes, she does engage in it. And sometimes she may really pick on him to set it off because she knows it's going to happen. And she wants to keep it in a place where she can control herself from not being hurt too badly. And so we have to look at the violence that women engage in whether or not it's reactive or self-defense, or whether it is initiative, whether she's the one who's the violent one. And I think you're right. About 5% of the cases that we know are women who were raised violent, raised in the middle of violence. They've learned that violence is the way to get what they want. And many of them need to be worked with so that they find better ways to get what they want. Unfortunately, the picking and continuous, it is continuous, kind of every time you try to deal with, come on, men, shape up. Men should be working with men. Men should be telling men, this is not masculinity. This is not the way a man should be. They don't do it. Instead, they whine. I'm sorry, I call it whining about how, well, women hurt us too. And it is true. Nobody wants to be with a couple that are continuously bickering with one another. That's not fun to be there. Right. But bickering is not domestic violence. And so we have to learn to separate those out.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things here. There's the dynamics and the characteristics of domestic violence. Mm-hmm. And there's the predictors of domestic violence. And one of the things we know is that intergenerational violence is certainly telling of whether or not you might find yourself either the victim or the batterer. Yes. Would you agree?
Absolutely. It's very interesting. The research today on epigenetics, on looking at the change trauma does to people's genetic makeup, is fascinating. We're just at the beginning of it, but it's really important because people change over generations. Sometimes you wonder, is it learned behavior? Is it genetics that passes down? And frankly, I think it's a little bit of both. And the more we know about the brain and about what passes down for brain physiology, the more we understand that we're complicated. Our wiring is very, very complicated. And this is what we're doing to study. When we get away from the male-female kind of, I call it jealousy, look at me kinds of stuff. And we really get into the basics. We're looking down at cells, what happens, the electricity, the chemicals, and its impact on brain cells and other cells in our body and our mind that create who we are.
Absolutely. And it's an integrated approach, right? So is it are we born that way, or is it, society, speaking of society, there's a historical context to battering, and particularly battering women. So, I'm sure that everybody has heard, rule of thumb.
Right.
I mean, maybe some of my students who are in their 20s, maybe they don't know that saying, maybe they never heard it before, but rule of thumb is, really kind of founded in this notion that it was okay for husbands to discipline their wives as long as the stick that they used wasn't any bigger than the circumference of their thumb. Right.
Right. And of course, this was because men were given the power and the responsibility of all behavior that their wives did. Women were not allowed to have their own minds. They had to follow what their husbands or their fathers wanted them to do. And in some cases, their brothers. Yes. And there are still some cultures that are that male dominated. It's no accident that we didn't learn about domestic violence as much as we know today until there was a feminist movement, until women said, wait a second, we want to be equal. We don't want more. We want the same, just the same opportunities that men have. but the fear and the criticism that we got, I'm sure you did too, in those days, when we first started talking about being feminist, continues till today.
Yes. Yeah. I did my internship at the Anti-Violence Project in Manhattan. And my dissertation, I said in the beginning, was on focused on examining the relationship between not only sex role identity and it's as a possible predictor, a predictor variable, if you will, on the outcome of domestic violence. But I also looked at relationship factors, and you mentioned jealousy, and jealousy was like the number one. That was the most significance that I had, was jealousy. And that's even though my research was, it was all right and it was good and it got me through. But, I look at it now and I would say a limitation of that is that jealousy is actually part of domestic violence. So is it like what comes first, the chicken or the egg kind of thing?
Yeah, we don't really know.
Wow.
And that jealousy is one of the factors that cuts through all racial and ethnic and cultural groups. So it's very interesting that it's important. I say for young women, one of the things you should look at when you're in a relationship, if there's too much jealousy going on, especially from the man to the woman, but also from the woman to the man. And sometimes it's justified. That's not unusual for batterers to cheat on their girlfriends or their wives. And so all of that kind of sexual property kinds of behavior is something we started to look at way back then, and we're still looking at it.
Yeah.
It still features in a lot of the cases we read about in the newspapers.
Yeah, which we're going to get into in a second. One more thing you mentioned earlier about trauma informed. So that's a little different maybe from the 90s literature to today, right? So, it's this notion of I had been exposed to some type of trauma or continuous trauma or cumulative trauma. And then now this is the outcome is this untreated, unhealed, not transformed trauma, right?
Yeah.
I mean, do you, and I think that also might be true of some of our shooters today.
Well, I think it is true of the ones that we know about. But most of them have also have been victims of child abuse or engaged in domestic violence themselves. And so they're all wrapped up together, and we have to look at them together rather than each one of the topics individually. I'm chairing the American Psychological Association's working group on professional guidelines for professionals who are working in the area of trauma and trauma disorders. And it's clear that we need specific training to be able to work in this area. We know so much about what will be helpful and some things that are really not as helpful.
Yes.
And that's very different. We didn't know that in the 90s.
Right, exactly. Yeah. There's a couple of cases that, this is kind of when was the OJ? What was the OJ case? What was the year?
1994 and 5.
Okay, so yeah, we're coming out so we're then the early 80s. For our viewers who don't know the domestic violence history, in the 80s, that's the kind of the battered woman's movement started to gain momentum. A lot of literature was being written about this. We were starting to look at we had the Violence Against Women's Act, which was valuable. And then we started looking at this whole notion of, how can we help batterers? So shifting the focus from, okay, why does this happen to, so now can you get some assistance, some help, some intervention, and so there are a lot of batterer intervention programs that were going on, a lot of psychoeducational programs. But the OJ case, you and the OJ case are very, very famous, right?
Right.
Because you served as a major consultant on that case
You
at
know,
that
it's
trial, right?
interesting. I sure was. I consulted with OJ's attorneys. At the time, I had known Johnny Cochran from some of the domestic violence work we were doing with prosecutors' offices, and he was a prosecutor. I was living in Denver, Colorado, and working with Norm Early, who was a Denver prosecutor at the time, and I knew these men, and they were good men, and really trying to change the way we prosecuted domestic violence cases. Because if we can stop men from abusing women at a low level, we're not going to reach the big murder cases. And so I was participating and testifying across the country, doing two things. One, I was trying to help people understand that you can look at what's happening when you look at a murder case, because it's so much glaring than in a low level domestic violence case, but it's basically the same. And so I was learning, and I was teaching people through the publicity of the media in these cases. And I would go across the country working on many different cases. I also, at that point, was trying to get the testimony that to understand that women's perception of danger and of self-defense is different than men's perception of self-defense. So we were changing the domestic violence way of prosecuting cases throughout the country. So now we're 1994. We're in most states, or not all, but many states were allowing the testimony, and we get to OJ, and I get a call from Johnny Cochran saying, I need your help on this case, that they're claiming that there's a lot of domestic violence. This is high publicity. We're getting hundreds of reports of people saying they saw domestic violence. Some we think really are, some we're not sure. Would you come help us figure them out? The judge says that he'll allow in those that seem to be real domestic violence and keep the others out. Well, I thought, okay, that seems like reasonable. And I said to Johnny at the time, I said, I don't think I want my name associated with it. You don't have to mention me unless you ask me. This is confidential between your team and me. And he was fine with it. The other thing I said was, if you continue to blame Nicole Simpson, who was OJ's deceased wife, I'm out of the case, because I don't care what she didn't deserve to be killed. And I don't know who killed her. That's not my job. My job was to really help figure out what was the domestic violence and the relationship in the case. So I thought it would be fine. I had no idea I was going to be as vilified as I was by the feminist movement.
Yes.
I was so angry with me. But you learn. While they were very angry, the psychological community were very supportive, because in the end, what I said was, look, I'm not an advocate, although sometimes I will advocate. I'm a scientist, and the scientific data weren't there. And so I was very clear about that. I got entree to everything. I walked the property. I looked at both houses. I looked at all the data in the case. There just wasn't enough scientific evidence to prove, and I guess the jury believed that as well.
Yeah, right.
Because, but it doesn't mean he didn't do it. It just means that there wasn't enough evidence.
Right, and beyond a reasonable doubt is that's a threshold that's not that easy. to
exactly. And I was shocked that some of the feminists were so angry. They took me off committees, they took back invitations to speak. I said, how could I, for 20 years, I am out there pounding the pavements with, being very clear about feminist perspective on domestic violence. Because I'm trying to work on this particular case, doesn't mean I'm not a feminist.
Right. But you're a scientist, like as you said, you're a scientist. You're not a spin doctor on a news network.
Right.
So that's
I survived it.
You survived it. Yeah.
I survived it because I kept true to the science, and that's what I tell all of my students,
Yes.
Stick to the scientific data.
Right, exactly. Just the facts, ma'am. Just the facts.
Yeah, don't get swept up in all the other hoopla.
Right, exactly. So I know that a lot of our viewers, are really itching to hear about this Amber Heard Johnny Depp case. And, it was really interesting because we wanted to put together a nice graphic to advertise this show tonight. And, we ran into a couple of snags around what can we show, what images are allowed and all of that jazz. But I really would like to just get to the facts as you know them and your analysis, because I think that your analysis is relevant and important. So tell us about how you got involved with that and what your take on it was.
Well, I was not directly involved in the case. I had some involvement as a consultant, a confidential consultant to some people who were involved in the case. But so I can't really tell you too much about facts, but I can tell you about my analysis of the facts.
Good. Yeah, that's what we want to know.
I think that's really important because this was a case where Amber Heard was disliked from day one. She was disliked by the media. She was disliked by Johnny Depp, of course, and his attorneys, and her attorneys were not well prepared. I just have to say that. If they were well prepared, you sure didn't see it in what we saw on television, because I wasn't in the courtroom. I just saw what everybody else did on television. They had no idea of how to cross-examine the experts. They had one of the top experts on Amber's side. She's been president of the division in psychology of trauma. She has worked on dozens of cases. I have utmost respect for her. And they did not know how to question her. They did not understand the data that she had, which is sometimes happens. If you don't have a lawyer who's willing to get really into all the data and understand it and work with the expert as colleagues, two people who are sharing each of your knowledge that you bring, it's going to make the case a mess, and this did. Johnny Depp, on the other hand, was very beloved. I mean, he has a fan club that's humongous, and it didn't matter what he did. Those fans were right there on his side. And I think that's fine. But what it did was it skewed how the general public looked at it. And I think what happened during that case, and he had a good expert as well, and his lawyers knew exactly how to put the expert up and the data that she had collected as well.
Dr. Walker, would you say that OJ had the same kind of sexy appeal and in the same way was sort of really well loved and celebrity status again, all of that? Would you say that there's some similarities here in these cases?
Maybe, but I think the racial factor would overcome that in the OJ case. It was a very divided media and country, and the fact that he was African American and he was a white woman. And the jury, Johnny Cochran called me after he got the jury. He said, we're really going to do well with this case. We've got 8 African American women on this jury. And they tried it in downtown Los Angeles, where there were more opportunity to get Black people on the jury because they understood the unfairness of what happens with the police way back then, and African American. So I think that was a bigger factor in the OJ case. I think in Amber Heard and Johnny Depp, it was much more change of time. The women were not behind Amber Heard. She's not a feminist. Her behavior was not well understood. There was so many intersectional factors that were going on there. I think that she engaged in some abusive incidents that were foolish. But she was young and she was scared and she didn't have any support. And Johnny Depp had hired people that saw what was happening. She claims they didn't tell the truth. I wasn't there, I don't know, but it certainly is possible. They were his employees and they could have stuck up for him. So she didn't have a lot of the witnesses that or if she did, nobody put them on the stand. They, the trial just was not going well for her. And I think that the judge was not very supportive either.
Of her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it could be not because of her, but because of her attorneys. They could have, the attorneys could have, annoyed the judge, and that sometimes happens.
Yeah, exactly. And that really hurt. That can really hurt the client.
Yeah.
But so here's the question, because I don't know if everybody is familiar with the dynamics and characteristics of domestic violence, but there's emotional abuse, there's financial abuse, there's sexual abuse, there's physical abuse. I mean, everybody knows kind of like the physical abuse and when it rises to the level of homicide or serious assault, right. Then everybody is just sort of like, okay, that's obvious. But not so obvious when it's this subtle emotional abuse, and it's almost like termites.
It's the power and control that we look for in domestic violence. Any of us can emotionally abuse somebody else, and it's not domestic violence. It's when it's in a pattern and when there's power and control, coercive control. That's when it becomes domestic violence. And so when we do evaluations, that's what we're looking for. Is what's the pattern, who makes the decisions, and how do those decisions get made, and what level of free will, nobody has total free will, of course, but what level of free will does somebody have? Amber was dependent upon Johnny Depp. And that was very different. In the OJ case, Nicole was not. She had her own life. She had her own, and from everything I read, she and OJ were getting along pretty well around the children. They were co-sharing, co-parenting children. And if anything, I gotta say that the one area that we have not made any inroads in whatsoever with the domestic violence movement is in child custody issues around when we recommend people separate. They no longer can live together. They need, we can't stop the violence. The goal isn't whether people should separate or not. I want to be clear. The goal is to live violence free, but sometimes you can't if you're in the same place. But the children tie them together. And the courts are, by forcing people to co-parent when batterers can't share. So why we would make them co-parent is a setup for more violence.
Yes.
And I think that's why we can't get rid of domestic violence, and we can't even lower it, right, because of the courts, the family courts.
when we look at crime overall and the trends of crime, we know that crime is sort of taken a little bit of a trend down, but not in the area of domestic violence. Isn't that true?
Yes.
And isn't it also true that while emotional abuse almost always precedes physical abuse, and that men are more likely than their female counterparts to really do some damage? If damage is going to be done, there's much more damage that's going to happen. And it's just by the very nature of, nature, right?
Sure.
But women, isn't it true that when women do get physical and violent, that it almost, it not almost always, but there's like a really large percentage where there's serious assault.
Well,
serious assault
they get hurt. Most women, if they fight back, get hurt worse.
If they fight back, but if they are the batterer, so like go back to that 5%, right? If they're the batterer and they are physical and they're violent, then there's a propensity there for homicide.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, there's a propensity. I like to say that there's a propensity for homicide in any of these cases, because it's like a brush fire. You don't know when it's going to get out of control.
Yes. Yes.
So that is definitely true. But women tend not to be trained to use parts of their body to fight. So they often need to go to a weapon, and that's why it gets worse in terms of the criminal justice system, because they're using knives and mostly guns, actually. Few knives, but not too many, because women's upper body strength is not as great as the man's.
Yes.
And so, I could go on a soapbox about guns. I won't do that. I promised I wouldn't, but
you didn't promise me.
No, that's true. I
didn't ask you to promise.
I promised myself, but the data are very clear in the areas where guns are not controlled in any way whatsoever. The number of deaths from guns is much higher. And you can take a slap, or you can fix a broken bone from some other kind of fight, but you can't once you have a bullet. It's not good.
Yeah.
And so it's and women, because women don't have the history of being able to learn how to fight and fight with men who sometimes the women are stronger than the men. It's not always just the strength, but they don't have the training in using their body to fight, and so they go to the weapon.
One of the things that we haven't talked about so far, and I am going to get to some of our questions already our chat is blowing up a little bit, but I want to just say that this whole conversation so far has been centered around heterosexual domestic violence and heterosexual relationships. And so domestic violence is sort of equal opportunity, opportunistic phenomenon, and it crosses all racial, ethnic, socioeconomic, as well as sexuality and sexual orientation.
Absolutely.
So same-sex couples are also experiencing either as victims of domestic violence or batterers themselves. And the problem for them, just like if it was an undocumented immigrant that was experiencing domestic violence, that there's this reluctancy to go to the police.
Right.
For fear of ridicule, stigma, turning you in, whatever it might be. And what I have seen over the years, being, in the NYPD for 20 years, is that sometimes cops don't even want to take the time to really assess what's going on. And so if it's two women or two men, it's like cross complaint. They both go. They both get arrested. And if they're women or two men, they wind up in the same cell. right? What's your assessment on this?
Well, absolutely. What you're saying is very true. I think that there are some distinctions in violence between two women. They tend not to be as life-threatening as the violence between two men, which is interesting. So police also don't pay that much attention to it because they don't see it as that dangerous, which of course it is. And it can be, I've had a number of cases where one woman killed the other woman. So that's why I say these are like brush fires. You just don't know
Right.
what's going to happen. You've got to treat every case very seriously
Absolutely.
when you deal with them. With men, there tends to be, we know more, let's put it this way, know more about men who are in short-term relationships. We know some about long-term relationships, but not that much. We know much more about short-term relationships. And those relationships, when there's domestic violence, tend to be very violent and very dangerous.
Yes.
So,
And
you know, we need more research and we need more work with couples like that are of different gender. I mean, the whole issue of gender these days, I don't know how you find it, Dr. Telesco, but I'll tell you, it's confusing with all the pronouns and with all the who's who and who identifies as what, and the whole idea of non-binary gender is something that we really haven't quite figured into our analysis in domestic violence yet.
absolutely. Yes, yes, yes. And and then if you enter in another variable like transgender, so that's a whole nother thing. And when we talk about education and educating our police really to be culturally competent and also to really understand the dynamics of domestic violence as it crosses all these different types of families, if you will, and types of relationships. I think education is key, and understanding and awareness of all of that. And I think that I know that I don't want to call him out, but somebody very important to me is in the webinar, and maybe he'll raise his hand and maybe he'll say a couple of things, but we tease each other back and forth. I'm comfortable quantitative. I'm comfortable with quantitative methodology. I'm not so comfortable with qualitative because I've never done it. I've never been the principal investigator of qualitative analysis. But I would think, based on my own dissertation and my own research in domestic violence, that sometimes you can really get to more potency with qualitative studies than you can with quantitative. So, rather than just check a box, what's your sexual identity, or what's your, fill in the blank, what dynamic of domestic violence are you either feeling victimized by or perpetrating yourself? I think that sometimes the qualitative might be more rigorous and potent and give us more information.
My own work was mixed methods. We used both. Because I think you're right. I think to get really down into what's going on and understand it from either the victim or the perpetrator's perspective, you have to have qualitative data. On the other hand, to make sense of it in the end, you need the quantitative. And I can't say enough praise for my methodological colleagues at Nova's our College of Psychology. They have been fabulous. We now have the Battered Woman Syndrome questionnaire. We validated it. We validated a lot of the research that I did while I was on the faculty there. And I'm continuing to work with them. I'm a Nova supporter. What can I say?
Yes.
I think it's really necessary to do both, to have develop kind of both of those I call them mixed methods.
Yes. Yes, yes, yes.
dissertation. So it's exciting. The work that's going on, that's different than in the 1990s. Now, nobody's making fun of people who want to do research in this area. In fact,
Right.
it's probably one of the most researched areas in universities and mental health and legal departments. So that's exciting.
Yes. Yes. And I think we would be remiss before I go to the chat. I know we could talk for hours on this. And we have a couple of questions about OJ and a couple of questions about Amber and Johnny Depp. But I think we would be remiss to not mention COVID and the lockdown as a like major risk, and putting victims in this vulnerable place where the lockdown forced them, the stay-at-home orders forced them to be in confined areas with their perpetrator. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. The Centers for Disease Control has come out with data suggesting that at least 3 times the amount of domestic violence went on during the lockdown during COVID.
Wow.
There were no domestic violence courts open. The courts were all closed. There were no lawyers working. Everybody was stuck at home. We're stuck at home with kids. Everybody's trying to teach little kids, and we didn't have any idea of how to do that. I mean, when you think about what our lives were like during that period of time, I can just say, thankfully, we're out of it. Hopefully, we're out of that.
Yeah.
It was a mess. We couldn't believe what our leaders, the leaders of our country, one would say one thing, the other would say another thing. That we were living in difficult times.
Yes.
But we survived. And that's a testimony to human survival.
Absolutely. Yeah. And
although millions, of course, didn't, but
right. I was going to say that. Unfortunate for the survivors and or victims during that time. So, Dr. Walker, we'll have a chance for you to come back and say like some, last words. But here's some questions. Okay. So Kathleen Nelson is asking, in your opinion, has the science that was utilized in the OJ case different than today? And would you come to the same conclusion?
Yeah, I would come to the same conclusions. The science, of course, is always growing. I might have had more information, but I had sufficient amount of information to make the decisions that I made. Most of my decisions were really whether somebody's descriptions were typical of domestic violence or not. And we had enough data. I think I found about 30, somewhere between 25 and 30 incidents that I said were really consistent with what we know about domestic violence at that time.
And that was for the OJ case.
For the OJ case.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
So, so it wasn't that different.
Here's another question. Same participant. Do you think the use of the bottle in Amber's accusation of Johnny is too extreme to likely be a lie?
No, I mean, I think her testimony was accurate. It was consistent with what we would expect from domestic violence survivors. And I think some of the things that she accused him of, she'd have to be a pretty good liar to be able to pull them off. She had a lot of details about what happened. Right. That's what we often look for when we're doing interviews. We're looking for the details. Do they make sense? Are they consistent?
Her description of his behavior, really kind of fit the bill.
There was no question in my mind. I don't know if there is in anybody's mind, that she was abused by him. And that was the sad thing about that case, was that was what the case was about. Was, did she defame him by saying he abused her when she posted something in the media? It wasn't a case about did he or didn't he do it. It was, did it come to defamation? Well, if he did all of the things that she said he did, and they were pretty consistent, then she should have won the trial. I mean,
and yet she didn't.
No.
Right. Yeah. So this same participant is echoing what you're saying. She felt that her description of Johnny's behavior was very indicative of battered women's syndrome, and that this participant, Kathleen, was booed for her opinion with friends. Do you feel her overall testimony was genuine and truthful? And do you feel her testimony surrounding the extreme acts of sexual violence were fabricated or truthful?
I thought they were truthful. Well, I mean, I don't know. I can't say that because I didn't do the evaluation. And if I did an evaluation, I would have asked a lot more questions than what was on the witness stand. But of course, that's accurate. You know, when you're testifying, you don't say everything that you found out in during your evaluation.
Yes.
So I guess the answer has to be I don't know, but they rang more true than not to me.
I'm going to put on the spot Layla Horton, who is one of our production assistants, and she's a criminal justice major. And I'm going to bring her on for whatever question she might have or comment that she might have for you, Dr. Walker.
Hi, Layla.
Hi, Dr. Walker. One question that I had while watching and listening was, do you think that domestic violence rates are different between like married couples compared to people who are just like cohabiting together?
No, I think that in my research, what I found was that domestic violence really became noticeable once the woman made a commitment to the relationship. Until she makes a commitment, he's more careful. But once she makes a commitment, then he thinks he has power and control over her. So then he starts with saying, does she, I don't like what dresses you're wearing, or I don't like the makeup you're using, or why don't you color your hair differently, or get boob job, or get bigger boobs, all of a sudden she becomes his property. And it doesn't matter whether they're married or whether they're just cohabiting.
Right.
But that's the piece that I found to be the significant one.
Wow. Thank you.
Great. That's it, Layla? No other follow-ups?
No, that's everything.
No,
I want to say something about Black women, because I think that we need, I'm re-looking at a lot of my data now through a different equity kind of eyes, if you will. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I've written about, and I still see today, is that Black women are much less likely to report to the police because the police have not been fair to Black men. And by reporting domestic violence, it feels like it's a betrayal, not just to the man, but to the whole race. Mm-hmm. And so I think sometimes African-American or Caribbean-American women tend to be hurt worse because they don't have the protection from outside. And I think that's something we need to do something about.
Oh, wow, that's really good. That's really good. 100%.
Thank you, Layla. Thank you for being here. So, Dr. Walker, the individual that I was talking about before is my fearless leader, Dr. Marcelo Castro. He's the dean of the School of Criminal Justice. He's the director of the PhD program, and he's got a question here. He says, "Hi, Lenore."
Hi, Dr. Castro.
Marcelo Castro here.
To hear from you, Marcelo.
As always, listening to you is a fascinating venture. Do you think that the #MeToo case is helping women's cases in court? Mm-hmm. And then also say hello to David.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I think that the Me Too cases in many ways are very supportive because we've learned to listen to what women have to say. But I think the courts are not doing their job with these cases. And I think that's a problem. Some of the pullbacks, I mean, I'm thinking of, why am I blocking on his name? the one who was who was a television, Cosby, Bill Cosby. That case was so well prepared, but nobody realized that he was that the prosecutors apparently made a deal with him, so he was prosecution proof. And so they put these poor women through everything, and then the appeal, he won the appeal. And so we have to be careful that we're not overzealous in some of them. I think those women are very brave, the women who have come forward. And I think they've helped other women come forward as well. So
Yeah.
I think it's a good thing in the end.
So Dr. Castro has a follow-up question. Do you see a possible fatigue effect taking place with these cases?
Well, that's very interesting. Sure, I think I would not have thought of it in that way, but I think that's a very positive way of thinking about it. We do get very excited when we're doing something new, especially when we're moving justice just a little bit forward. And so I think there may be a fatigue effect. That maybe, these cases are taken on contingencies by lawyers, and so they have to think it's a good enough case that they're going to win some money for their client, because that's how they get paid. And I think that some of the decisions that didn't go well for them, they weren't slam dunk decisions, made it a little bit hesitant for lawyers to take the cases.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Castro, for being with us.
Thank you, Dr. Castro.
Great questions. So I'm going to call Joey up. Joey Jasinski is my project manager. He's a work study student. He is not a criminal justice major, but we love him anyway. And and everybody needs an accountant, especially this time of the year, right? As we're getting closer to the April 15th. So Joey will keep us out of the audit situation. But anyway, Joey, please, do you have a question for Dr. Walker?
I do. Thank you, Dr. T. And also thank you, Dr. Walker, for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it. I actually have two questions. So my first one is similar to the COVID situation. I was wondering if you have studied anything about the stock market crash in 2008 and 2009, and if that had an effect on domestic partnerships or, stuff like that. Economic situations, can they cause domestic issues?
Yeah, that's a good question, Joey. I remember a lot of talk back then about whether or not economics can cause it. My take at that time, and I haven't looked at it since, is that economic crashes like that are not going to cause domestic violence. They'll worsen it. So if it's already there, it'll make it worse.
Right.
Because of the stress. Any kind of stress is going to make things worse.
Right. The rise of unemployment, stuff like that would. Okay, that makes sense.
Exactly. And we've been doing, during COVID, we did a lot of webinars and a lot of roundtables and tried to teach people how to lessen their anxiety, lower the stress rate, a lot of different kinds of exercises to keep things cool. Normally, we would have taught them to get out, but we don't teach them that when you can't go anywhere. So that's what we had to change teaching.
Stress is definitely a big factor.
Right.
My second question, I was going to ask, how often is it that the people who are being abused return to their partners?
Very good question, Joey. My experience is, in my research, is that it takes 3 to 5 times of leaving before somebody is really able to disentangle. And if there are children and young children, it keeps them together longer, because this is going to sound crazy, but you're safer together when you have children than separate, because you must continue to have a relationship around passing kids back and forth. And so you can protect your children better when you're still at home.
Right.
Great.
Right. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you, Joey. We'll see you later.
See you
You're going to
later.
come back and give us a little bit of a shameless plug commercial on some of our upcoming stuff, right? I have one more in the chat, one more waiting, and then Dr. Castro has his mic ready to go. He's going to ask you a question. So
Oh,
let's see, Kathleen, do you think the courts have been fair on the release given to women who were jailed for murder but discouraged from testifying about the abuse they suffered from their victim?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question.
Yeah, I'm not either. So Kathleen, I'm going to just give you, you're going to just ask the question yourself. Okay. So hold on a second. I'm going to just give you mic privileges. Go ahead. If you can just ask Dr. Walker the question, please. Kathleen?
Okay, I had to press the unmute button. Can you hear me?
Yeah. You're good. We hear you.
What I was referring to is many women, I guess through groups who were trying to free women from prison that had been convicted of murder of their abuser. And that a lot of them expressed that they were encouraged by their attorney not to discuss their abuse because it was not considered a defense.
Yeah, well, that was very true back in the 80s and 90s. And there are many women who are still languishing in prison because of that. It's not true now as much, although we're still doing reviews of a lot of cases that the court did not allow the testimony in different states. The most important one is New York. We're doing a number of reviews of cases of sentences for people that had very long sentences. And when you review it, the case actually has something to do with domestic violence. And so the judges there are now listening to cases. We're reviewing them and providing reports for attorneys there. And I think it's a very important area. We did a lot of that here in Florida. Back, I think, probably in the 90s, we did a number of cases. I'm sure, I don't know that anybody in the domestic violence groups have looked at Florida cases recently. I haven't heard anything about it. We did California cases in Ohio. We got the laws changed in Ohio and in Maryland. This was all back in the 90s, mostly the 1990s.
I guess my question is more of, I did see a documentary where there were several women that had petitioned for release, but the judges only granted like 2.
Yeah, well, that's too
Wondered
bad.
if you felt those were fair, the opinions they came to, if you felt that was fair, or if those other women who had petitioned for release should have been released, given it, because it all seemed to be around the circumstance that they were discouraged from talking about their abuse.
Well, certainly. I mean, without looking at the case itself, I think each case has its own trajectory. So without looking at the case itself, I don't know if it's fair or not fair, but certainly I think every case should be reviewed if the person feels that they didn't get a fair trial.
Do you think most courts are giving that the validation that these women really should have, or do you think that they are, how do I put it?
I think it's up to the individual judge. Some judges are well trained and understand domestic violence, others do not.
That's where I was going with that.
Great. Thank you so much, Kathleen. Thank you for your
Thank you,
participation.
Kathleen.
Thank you. So I'm going to call on now our last criminal justice major, Madison Geller. She's actually a student of mine in criminal justice special topics class. Thank you, Madison, for coming on. And what's your question for Dr. Walker?
Hi,
So my
Madison.
question is, earlier when you were talking to Joey, you mentioned how if there's children in the picture, that could be good because the parent can protect them. But in some cases where like the kids might see their parents getting abused, could that cause them to become violent in a relationship when they're older?
That's a very good question. What we know from research is that for boys, the most potent factor to have them be at high risk, of course, nothing is one-to-one, but for high risk for becoming an abuser is seeing their father batter their mother. That's not true for girls. For girls, the most highest risk is being a woman.
Wow.
Yeah, scary, isn't it?
Was that Kathleen? Because that was interesting.
my mic is still on.
Kathleen couldn't help it. She just like burst out, and I was like, "Wow, Madison, how are you throwing your voice that way? This is really amazing."
I didn't know the mic was still on.
I'm just teasing you. That's awesome. Thank you. No, I'm so glad that I had the same reaction, within myself. Madison, any other questions?
No, that's my only question.
Okay,
Thank you.
great. Thank you so much for joining us. And
Thank you.
so now I am going to ask for Dr. Castro to engage his mic and ask you this very important question.
Hi, Lenore. Marcelo here.
Hi, Marcelo.
How are you?
Nice to hear you.
Listen, I can be on camera if you want me to, but I just came back
Yes,
from
I'd love to see your beautiful face.
Oh, thank you for that. It doesn't look beautiful. I ran 10 miles a few minutes ago. Just came running, and this is what you have. So, Dr. T, if you want to engage, enable the camera, you may.
Oh, okay, wonderful. So we're
Yeah.
going to see what it looks like after you've run 10 miles?
Yeah, especially the Nike shirt.
Okay, wow. All right, well, we're very excited, and we're waiting with bated breath. So I'm going to make you a co-host, and then you could share your video. There you are. I'm going to spotlight you.
That's so nice to see you.
Lenore, it's great to see you.
Yeah.
Time goes by and on my end, not on yours. You just look
well.
exactly the same.
I'm getting there. I'm moving on.
It's really, really, really nice to see you. And I didn't have time to shower because I wanted to be on time and listen to every
You
word
look
of yours.
beautiful.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
Here's the thing I wanted to mention, and this is a little deviation from the central topic, but it is really down your alley. I don't know if you know, but Grace is working really, really close to Davie PD and Davie Police Department, and we were having a lunch meeting with them, and they just throw something on the table that was quite interesting and surprising. They have the highest number of Baker Acts in the state.
Wow.
Yeah, that's exactly. And they said, and they don't know why, and they don't know where, how to begin to grasp the issue. And of course, they looked at us as a resource, and they said, we would like for you to, we're going to share with you some of the data that we have and work with you on anything that you may help with. But we're looking at, they had like 600 and something cases in 20 to 21. At 687 calls, 60% of those ended up in involuntary hospitalizations. And they're trying to get the case, the issue in a way that it doesn't cost police department resources as it is right now. and bring a solution. They're truly solution oriented and community oriented. So we're going to start looking at it, and down the road, maybe we will knock on your door and have a conversation with you.
I'd be delighted. When I was working at the public defender's office with Howard Finkelstein,
yes.
the state came down hard on them for having too many cases of not competent to stand trial. And they were furious and said, you're costing us too much money. Of course, that was the big thing, because if you have a not competent, you had to provide services to try to make the person competent again.
Right.
And so that's different, of course, than Baker Act, but we're dealing with the same type of decisions. How are we evaluating whether somebody needs Baker Act? How, do they need mental health services and they're not getting them? Are there mental health services in the community in the first place? When Judge Ginger Lerner Wren set up the mental health court in Broward County, she had no services for her people. And right. I mean, she just had to work the community to get more and more and more services, mental health services. So these are all the questions that go along with what you're going to have to look at.
Awesome.
Who has, are there places for people other than Baker Act?
Excellent. And we will, now that you mention her, we will consult with Judge Lerner Wren, because she teaches for us and she is amazing. She's
fabulous. She's fabulous.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And again, say hi to David, and you're both missed.
Oh, thank you. We miss Nova. We're emeritus, so we are doing some research. And if you've got brilliant research students, sometimes we still have a small private practice. Sometimes we take them into our practice. So.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you. Great to see you.
Thank you, Dr. Castro. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you so much, Dr. Walker. Final words, anything that you would like our viewers to know? And, we're live, but we're also recording this. So this is archived on our Fischler College of Education School of Criminal Justice YouTube channel. We have a lot of subscribers, over 500 subscribers. So if you are watching on YouTube right now and you have not subscribed yet, please hit the subscribe and hit the bell for notifications when we go live. So, Dr. Walker, I'm going to give you the last word.
I think this is so exciting. It was not, you didn't exist. This YouTube channel didn't exist when I was still teaching there. I'm gone, 6 years? It's a long time already. But the wonderful work that you're doing, please keep it up. And I love being a guest here, and I love talking to the students who are our next generation of work. It's so important, the work that we're all doing.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Walker, for your time, for your brilliance, and sharing everything, your analysis with us tonight. And so I thank you so much for being here. And I'm going to ask for Joey to come on, if he doesn't mind, and give us a little taste of what's to come, because I think we've got a forensic expert bug lady. Am I right? Entomologist?
Yes, you are correct.
All right.
So we have nothing else for February. This is our last show for February. But as Dr. T said, our next show is March 9th, and we have forensic entomologist, board certified, Dr. Adrienne Brunjar. She's from Texas A&M, and the show is going to be called Maggots, Murder, and More. So stay tuned for that, March 9th. And then March 30th, we're bringing back Ed Densel with his Missing Persons podcast. He's going to be talking about the case of Karen Moore, which is something very close to the town of Davie, where NSU is located. That's all I'll say. And as for April, On April 12th, we have Dr. Vincent Van Hassel. He's a police psychologist. The title is called Police Mental Health. That's April 12th. That's a Wednesday, not a Thursday. So it's a little bit different.
A little bit different. We had to accommodate Dr. Van Hassel, and he's so worth it that we changed it to Wednesday.
Exactly.
So yeah, mark your calendars for that one.
And then we're going to have another show the next day, Thursday, April 13th, and we're bringing back Sheriff Wayne Ivey. He's been on the show before. The title of this show is The Media and Law Enforcement. So he's a sheriff of Brevard County. And as for May, we have Dr. Penny Brown. She's coming May 11th. She's a very long title. She's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Management Operations in the Office of Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights. So that's a mouthful.
But for what administration?
For the Deputy U.S. of Agriculture.
The Biden administration.
For the current administration, yes.
Biden administration. It's a big appointment for one of our graduates, PhD in criminal justice, the Honorable Judge Penny Brown Reynolds. And so that's very exciting. And we're calling that Spotlight, right? Spotlight on our CJ graduates.
Yes. Alumni Spotlight, yes. I
Good.
forgot to say she's NSU affiliated. So
yes. And she's amazing. She's very dynamic. And we're very proud because Biden administration tapped her, and that says a lot about NSU, right, Dr. Walker, Dr. Castro? I think so. And that's it, right, Joey? I'm tired just listening to everything that you're saying. And so thank you again. Thank you, Joey. Thank you, Layla. Thank you, Madison Geller, for being behind the scenes, our CJ students. Thank you. And I also want to just take this opportunity to thank Dr. Durham, Dr. Kushner, our deans, Dr. Castro, who you all have met, for all their support and all the program that we do. Dr. Walker, I'm sad that this is ending tonight. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. Thank you. And I hope that we can maybe collaborate and do something else in the future.